Ray Fittipaldo of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette went on 93.7 The Fan, was asked about the Steelers' offensive line this year and said maybe Dan Moore Jr. is on his way out if the Steelers get what they're looking for in the NFL draft. Quote, they had to start him as a rookie. He wasn't very good, got a little bit better each and every year, but he's still not a guy that I want on my as my blindside protector. I think he's a guy who has the respect of Mike Tomlin and Pat Meyer. I think he's worked hard to achieve that, but he's certainly a guy who would be over-recruited, and he's a guy who could potentially not be on this roster in 2024 if things break a certain way with the draft and how these guys come along. Dan Moore Jr., on his way out. We've talked about this more than once. We've talked about, the future of the offensive line more than once. I've been on 93.7 The Fan. I've been on here. I've been asked about, hey, but the Steelers really like Dan Moore. They respect Dan Moore as an offensive tackle. They love Dan Moore. They think Dan Moore is a great guy. They think Dan Moore is a leader. They think that Dan Moore is a dude who, probably overstepped any potential that he had in a crappy circumstance coming into the NFL. I think that Dan Moore in that facility really is respected as a human being, but there's a difference between respected as a human being and business. And, well, this is a business, and at the end of the day, Dan Moore Jr. is probably an easy option to send out the door because it just makes too much sense. You could look at the NFL draft and say, okay, if the Pittsburgh Steelers get Armarius Mims, if the Pittsburgh Steelers get, Tyler Guyton, if the Steelers get, who's the dude out of Washington that I can never pronounce his name, Troy something with an F. If you get any of those guys and you're looking at this and saying, hey, look at our offensive line looks pretty good right now, why not get rid of Dan Moore? You're not going to just cut him. That doesn't make any sense because at that point you could put Dylan Cook on your practice squad. Nobody's going to grab Dylan Cook. You can make Dan Moore your last offensive tackle, and chances are he's not going to be active most games, or he is going to be active. But I think it makes so much sense if they get a tackle just because they already have all their pieces to the puzzle. They could look at this and say, Broderick Jones is our left tackle. Rookie is our right tackle. Spencer Anderson's our swing tackle. And I think they like Spencer Anderson in that role. I think he plays it better than Dan Moore Jr. I think that he's got the ability to move more comfortably from side to side than Dan Moore Jr. I mean, Dan struggled last year in training camp playing the right side. He couldn't do it for the life of him. And I felt bad because that was his role, but it also probably saved him from getting benched during the season because they had to look at it and say, this dude can't be a swing tackle. If he's only one side, I think that you can move on from him. And it has to be through a trade, you're not going to cut Dan Moore Jr. on the last year of his rookie deal and say, all right, second year, 7th round guy. That's who we're banking on here, because screw it. Let's save a couple $100,000. No, you're not going to do that. You're going to trade him. You're going to see what you could get and you'll move on from there. What can you get for Dan Moore Jr.? If you're going to toss out a trade, you getting anything better than a 7th round pick?
See, I would say no, but at the same time, you saw what they got for Kendrick Green last year, and it's all about timing too. When these teams go through training camp, do they suffer injuries? Is there an opening on a team that is desperate to say, all right, we need an NFL guy? And what you want to say about Dan Moore or not, he was an NFL guy at left tackle last year. Right tackle, there's a big question mark on him there, but you'd have to say he's something around a Kendrick Green or even the Kevin Dotson, because Dotson, I think, showed similar promise, but still struggled in Pittsburgh. I think he's more so aligned with Dan Moore than Kendrick Green was. So I would think you'd have to get something more than a 7th round pick, especially if the circumstance lines up like it did last year with the Kendrick Green trade and also with the Kevin Dotson trade.
I agree. I think you could get a 6th. I think you could get a 5th in a really good situation. I think if you could pull off a 4th, that'd be unbelievable, but that'll never happen. I would say right now, if I had to guess, let's just say everything falls into place for the Steelers. They add a defensive tackle and they add an offensive tackle. I would say the two guys, because you always go into training camp and you look at the roster and you say, these are the guys that are going to be gone by the end of the season. Last year, it was Kevin Dotson, most likely. Kendrick Green was certainly on that, but everybody thought at that point he was going to get cut. And Mason Rudolph was the other one, and that one didn't happen. It should have been Mason for 2 years, and it didn't happen. This year, it's Dan Moore, and it's probably DeMarvin Leal. And I think both of those guys, there's just not the space on them, and they hold enough value. And with rookie deals, I mean, you could trade Dan to a better circumstance and say, you need I think it's different than Kevin Dotson. I'm not saying trade wise. I think you make a good point there. I just mean potential wise, because Kevin Dotson was viewed as an NFL starter. That dude has so much talent, and the Steelers got a glimpse of that talent, and they knew what they were working with when they added him and when they gave him the starting job. It just didn't work out. He couldn't get over the mental mistakes. It wasn't the type of offense that he should have been in. He goes to LA. Everything just kind of adds up perfectly. That's why he's staying there, because he understands that that's a perfect fit for him. Dan Moore is more of, I don't know if it's the offense. I don't know if it's him, but I don't think he's going to be a long-term starter in the NFL. But I think he could be a really good swing tackle for a long time. And I think a really good swing tackle in the NFL is worth some money for longevity. Like, you could look at this guy and you could be the backup offensive lineman for your team for the next 5-6 years. That's not bad. And then you just move on to the next one and you see if something else emerges somewhere, or maybe you get an opportunity in a couple of years and you've developed enough to be, not a half bad starter. I think that that's there for him. And I think that a team will view that and say, we need that. I don't know if somebody's getting hurt and people are calling saying, hey, Dan Moore, we need that guy. I think Chuks Okorafor would have fit that mold. I think teams would have called for Chuks. I think his contract was too big, but I think if it was reversed and he was on a rookie deal, people would have called for Chuks. I don't think they're going to call for Dan. I think the Steelers are going to have to reach out and look the other way, and that's going to end up a 6th-round pick, maybe a 5th. But I think it's there, and I think the possibility is very strong, because I expect the Steelers to add an offensive tackle in the NFL draft, early in the NFL draft. And I just think they like Spencer Anderson too much. I think Dylan Cook is a pretty decent final offensive tackle who's this guy's only 2-3 years in the league. He's super young. He just started playing offensive line a couple of years ago, because you got to remember this dude was a quarterback. So, you got to look at these and say they have the pieces to replace him if a trade presents itself. Now, if it doesn't, there's no chance. This isn't Kendrick Green. They're not going to cut him just because he stinks. He's good enough to start in the NFL if you need him to start in the NFL. But if they can replace him, I do think they're going to replace him. I think that's the way it's going to go. So I would say that's a name to watch. That's a move to watch for the Pittsburgh Steelers, certainly, as we move forward.